because sometimes they
I'm
look
ready
at
to
it and says,
Good morning, everybody.
that's not you.
Aloha. My name is Rob Hack, and my company is Insight Inter-Asia, a marketing company specializing in Asia. But I'm here this morning on behalf of the Hawaii Pacific Export Council, HPEC. We are a nonprofit that's based here at the Foreign Trade Zone, and we help companies from Hawaii and the Pacific region export, learn how to export. Primarily our work involves exporting to Asia, but it doesn't have to be. We can export to Canada, help companies export to Mexico, Europe, South America, or wherever. However, here in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, we tend to help companies export to Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, Singapore, India, and other Asian countries. So we've put together a panel today of largely HPEC board members who are volunteers on the HPEC board who have a tremendous amount of experience in Asia doing business, negotiating, living there, and understand the cultural differences between Hawaii and what's going on in these specific countries that we'll cover today. So this is our final seminar of this cycle. We were able to put on these seminars due to a grant from DBET, which was fantastic, and we'd like to thank DBET for that grant. And with that, we'll have Jamie Lum from DBET come up and give some words at our final seminar of this season.
Aloha, good morning, everyone. And my apologies to the panel for standing behind you, but the microphones are here for the video purposes. So welcome all of you to our the last of our HiSTEP Export Readiness Training series that we're happy to partner with HPEC on, and we just thank them for all the work that they've done in these last few months. It's been a great partnership. As Rob mentioned, the funding that we have to put on what we call our Hawaii State Trade Expansion Program, or HiSTEP, comes from the Small Business Administration. It's funds that are intended to nationwide increase U.S. exports. So each state puts forth proposals. It's a competitive process. And so we are actually currently waiting to hear if we will get funding for the next fiscal year. So we should know sometime next month. But anyway, so we have basically three components to our HiSTEP program. You are participating in one aspect of that, which is our export readiness training. As I said, we've worked with HPEC, and we've been working with the Small Business Development Center. Joe Burns and some of his staff are here this morning. And that's really to prepare any company, whether you're brand new to exporting or you've been exporting, but you want to get into a different market, or you have other products that you want to take into a market you might already be in. But these sessions are intended to explore either markets or specific topics that will impact you in terms of exporting. So with all of the information that you gain from that, hopefully that you're able to put together an export plan or refine a plan that you might already have. With that plan, then you can move into other areas of the program, which are basically we have our Hawaii pavilions, where DBED selects certain trade shows that we feel are beneficial for a large number of our Hawaii companies, and we will organize a Hawaii pavilion. We'll go out and recruit companies to participate, and the funds from the HiSTEP are used to subsidize a large portion of the cost for the trade shows and so forth. So we have several of those that we have scheduled throughout the year. One of the largest ones we participate in is the Tokyo International Gift Show, which is coming up next month. And at the end of June, we actually had a prep session for that, for people that are going to the show, as well as those that were just interested in getting to the Japanese market. So that's just one example of one of the shows that we're going into. That's our Hawaii Pavilions. That's a second component of HiSTEP. The last component is what we call our financial assistance program, where, again, this is a competitive process. Companies apply. present your export plan, and basically we see how how your plan is worked out, and we see what funds we have available, and hopefully you can get awarded to participate in things that might not necessarily be. It doesn't have to be DBED. It doesn't have to be Hawaii Pavilions. It can be other markets or other shows or other things you want to go and do to further your export goals. So those are basically the three components of HiSTEP. As I said, we're waiting to hear what funding will be available for the next fiscal year. I know that our website is up there also, which is all the things that I've just told you about are on our website, which is Invest.Hawaii.Gov, and you just go under the exporting tab. So again, thank you all for being here. Thank you for participating. I'll be here for the whole program, so if you have any questions following that, feel free to come and see me, but thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Jamie. As I mentioned, this is our last seminar of this current cycle, where this is our 12th meeting, and we've had topics that we covered here for exporters on issues such as finance, legal topics, logistics. We had two country-specific seminars this year, one on Taiwan and one on Canada. That was very interesting. There's a wide range of topics that we cover for the exporters, and I encourage you to go back and look at either the DBET website or our HPEC YouTube channel, and you can see the videos of those seminars if you're interested in any of those topics. So as this is the last seminar of the cycle, I would like to thank some of our partners that we've had for the whole year, including FTZ, the Foreign Trade Zone number 9, which is this facility here, and they allow us to use this fantastic room and all their equipment. So we have to certainly say thank you to them. I'd like to thank Doug Kazama right here of FX Studio as our videographer. He's been putting together extremely professional videos. Joe Burns from SBDC in the back there for small business concerns. Please see him. He's a local expert on helping you with your small business issues, and has been doing a lot of the intake for this program, the HiSTEP program. So thank you to Joe. And with that, let's get started. I'd like to briefly, if I can, introduce this fantastic panel that we've put together. As I said, everybody here is a board member of the Hawaii Pacific Export Council with long careers in the exporting business, and I'm going to go through their bios very briefly, but I'm sure when you have such very experienced people, you're going to leave something out of their bio, and I apologize for that in advance. First, let's introduce on the far end David Day, Esquire, famous international lawyer here in Honolulu, is with an emphasis on Southeast Asia and the ASEAN countries. Mr. Day is currently involved in commercial projects in Japan, Taiwan, Vietnam, Singapore, Philippines, Indonesia, China, and Korea. He has assisted U.S. clients working or entering markets throughout most countries in the Asia-Pacific region. He has a great deal of experience on Vietnam and Indonesia, which is the reason I asked him to be part of our panel today. In fact, you were a founding member of the Indonesia-Hawaii Chamber of Commerce, is that right? Director. Yeah. Okay, great. So David will speak first in a minute, and then he has to run off to a meeting and conduct some very important international business. So we'll hear from him first, and then he'll depart, but the rest of us will remain for the entirety of the program. Next is Bill Oberlin, who lived in Korea for a very long time. He was president of Boeing Korea, and also was the chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in Korea, which is a very powerful lobbying force there in Korea, working on behalf of U.S. companies there. Next is the HPEC chair, Brenda Foster. She, for many years, was the executive director at the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, and has a tremendous amount of experience in Asia, particularly China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Finally, we have Betty Brow. financial advisor at Merrill Lynch. She is on the Vietnamese American Chamber of Commerce. She happens to also be the vice chair of the Hawaii Pacific Export Council. So these two ladies are running the HPEC. And then you're also on the Japan America Society of Hawaii, is that correct? So very, very busy and very Asia focused. And again, my name is Rob Hack. I'm on the HPEC board, and during my career, I've been based everywhere in Asia, I think, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Beijing for a couple of years, Malaysia, Hong Kong, if I didn't mention that. So I can answer lots of questions here too. So if we can, we'll get started right now with David Day because I know he has a bit of a rush schedule. So if we can you start with, up to you, Indonesia or Vietnam, and tell us about some cultural differences of doing businesses in those countries, please.
Okay, let me just see a show of hands first here. How many of you were here at the one of the programs where I was talking about the difference between the business model that Americans use to conduct a deal, the negotiation model, and from the Asian perspective? How many of you remember me talking about a sharp sushi knife slicing through that business deal and what it looked like? You're gonna see a show of hands. Okay, a few of you. And this is being broadcast inter-island, right?
Yes.
Okay, and so for those of you, you don't have to raise your hand if you're sitting on Maui or Kauai or the Big Island, it's okay. But for those of you who did not, the concept is this: if you had a business deal and you had a really sharp sushi knife and you could slice through it, what would be the difference? And the difference is, in the American perspective, the deal is driven by a contract. And some of you may remember that, okay? And if you take the Asian perspective on the same business deal, it's not driven by a contract, it's driven by a relationship. Idea is to create a relationship, and out of that relationship comes trust. And so that's going to hold true for every single one of these countries that we're going to talk about this morning. And I think as a business person, the thing that you got to remember is the critical phrase. You know, you have all this learning and expertise, and you got your logistics, and you got this and that, but honestly, culture is everything. It's the culture. Just remember, it's the culture. You get the culture straight, and you'll have a better chance at it. And so to help you with that, just a couple quick tips here. Number one is that there are some what I call beginner books that you can start out with. Kiss, bow, or shake hands. This is the global edition of this book, and Brenda's got the Asia version. It's extracted out of it. Now understand that this is a beginner's toolkit. You could actually copy the 20 pages for a particular country, go to the airport and read it over dinner en route to Hong Kong, and you'd be better off than nothing. But again, it's a beginner's, it's a starting place, and for each of the countries here, each of these speakers will take it to a completely different level. And in case the pages, Betty and I were just talking beforehand that on Vietnam, it's behind the power curve here because Vietnam has changed quite a bit. So let's talk about Vietnam and Indonesia. And together, these two countries are the recipients of what I call the Great Bleed Out. And the Great Bleed Out is the shift in emphasis due to rising costs of labor and the crackdown by the central government of Beijing in terms of U.S. foreign investment into China. So Vietnam and Indonesia are the beneficiaries of this. A lot of American and foreign businesses moving to these two countries. And so the difference between the two, and I'm not going to go back and forth, but just at the very beginning, understand, I think, that from my perspective, and of course, Betty's going to have a slightly different perspective, and that's a good thing, and you need to take both perspectives. But from my perspective, having done a fair amount of business in Vietnam, I would say Vietnam is a truly capitalist society, and it's wrapped with the tissue paper of communism. It's not to say the tissue paper is not important, or the government doesn't control. It's just that if you just lift up that tissue paper, you see a truly capitalist society. Flipping over to Indonesia, Indonesia is a robust democracy now, and with some things that you need to watch, and that has to do with some challenges to the Jokowi presidency coming from the conservative Islamists that are raising a challenge now in the wake of the governor of Jakarta's Ahok's conviction in a blasphemy trial, and he was jailed due to some comments that he made during the heat of a political campaign. So it may be that Indonesia is going to tighten up a little bit on the conservative Islam side. Now, let's focus on Vietnam very quickly here for a minute. The first thing that I would tell you about Vietnam from the culture is heads up in terms of women. Oh my God, he's raising a controversial subject right out of the box. There are two major streets that are boulevards in Ho Chi Minh City and in Hanoi, and those streets carry the name Hai Ba Chung. It means the two Chung sisters. And they're the equivalent of maybe our Ala Moana Boulevard. What's important about this is that the Vietnamese woman is prevalent all over the place in business, in government, in Vietnam, in terms of prominency. And so there was an article in the Wall Street Journal a few years back that said that Vietnam has more senior corporate executives who are women than in the United States. And the reason I raised these two streets, Hai Ba Chung, is that the Vietnamese have a history, unlike any other country in the world, where women had positions of senior military leadership and senior positions in combat. There's no other country like that, and even more so than Israel in recent times. And so the Vietnamese woman is at the business table. She will be across from you, and just recognize that historically she earned that position not through rule of law, but through the shed of blood. And it's a very powerful situation. The Vietnamese woman, they're not exactly, I would say, equal in society in every respect, that's for sure. The Vietnamese woman just has to do it all and work like crazy. So you'll see women in senior levels of government, and your counterparts on the other side in the business may well be women. Now, the country is divided into three basic business sections. Hanoi in the north, Da Nang in the central Vietnam portion, and Ho Chi Minh and the city of Con Tua in the south. And there are different accents, just like we have in our country. And so, with apologies to Betty, this is what it sounds like to my American ear. If you're from Hanoi, you say the name of the city in the central part of the country as Da Nang. If you're from that city, you don't say Da Nang, you say Da Nang. And if you're from Ho Chi Minh City, you don't say Da Nang or Da Nang, you say Da Nang. Something like that. And Betty can correct that and get that correct. But you know, you can hear the difference in the accents. And
I'm from the north, so the north is the true Vietnamese.
That is a sign of a good panel where you can have your intellectual sword fights. Now here, as business people, here's what you really need to know in terms of negotiations. I think, in my experience, having done business all over Asia, that the Vietnamese are the closest to the Americans in a negotiating style that you will ever find. They do have this beautiful, it's called, the technical term is the dance of the Goonie birds, that they will run at the outset of a negotiation. And they're kind of playing with you. It's very aggressive back and forth. But when they finally got the trust level built and they're going to do a deal, they can be very straightforward, and the American brand carries a lot in Vietnam. They love to do business with Americans. And so I find the Vietnamese very straightforward after you build that trust. Just a couple of tips here. I would say forget talking about the Vietnam War. They don't, 80% of the country was born after the war ended, and they have no memory and no interest in it, and it's all behind them. So you're not going to find common ground there. The other is, I would say, be very careful about negative comments of the government, because the tissue paper still holds water. And particularly in the northern part of the country where Betty is from, I would also, unless you have studied the history very carefully and can talk about Ho Chi Minh with some degree of expertise, I would stay away from that subject unless you are sure you're going to be able to be very respectful. Ho Chi Minh in the northern part of Vietnam still to this day is treated as an important icon of the country and commands enormous respect. And in fact, in a number of Vietnamese homes in the northern part of the country, they still have pictures of Ho Chi Minh in the house there. Let's talk about a tip you need to know, and that's you come out to the front of your hotel. Culturally, how do you cross the street?
Very carefully.
Oh my God, the motorbikes and the traffic, and those of you who've been there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. In my first trip to Vietnam, I didn't know how to do this, and so I walked around the block. And I walked around the block again, and I couldn't figure it out. And eventually there was this pregnant lady who taught me how to cross the street. Now, you can only do this culturally in Vietnam. So what I'm going to teach you here, do not try this in Honolulu or in Indonesia or Philippines, Malaysia. You can only do it in Vietnam. And the technique is this. Understand you got a two-way street. And so in the lane next to the curb, you look down the lane and make eye contact with the motorbike drivers and step out into the street. And you maintain eye contact with each one that's coming at you and is potentially going to run you down. Maintain eye contact and keep moving at the same slow pace, and they will not hit you. They go around you if you do it exactly as I'm teaching you. If you don't, prepare to wear tire tracks up the front of your shirt the rest of the day. And when you get to the middle of the street, for God's sakes, look the other way and do the same thing to get yourself across. And you can cross in a mass of motorbikes and traffic and cars. And so don't do this in front of a bus, obviously. But the motorbikes, they will respect you and they will not hit you as long as you keep the pace steady and maintain the eye contact with the oncoming drivers. An area that you'll have to be careful about is the concept of corruption in Vietnam. It's everywhere, it's very heavy. Basically, it's referred to as the hoi lo, the white envelope. You'll have to stay away from this as Americans. Be very careful about this. Just so that you know, many of the government offices in the state, they have a concept called the Weed In, the Black Fund. And so you would see this in Vietnamese customs, for instance. Within a given office, they pool their bribes, and then they pass out a dividend at the end of the month, the Black Fund, the Weed In. And so you've got to have the Vietnamese Customs Authority is a big challenge if you're importing into that country. And don't think that you're just going to be able to pass this off to an agent to handle it for you, because depending on that relationship, you may run afoul of the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So you have to be very careful, particularly with the Vietnamese customs. Business dress in Vietnam is more formal than here. And I would say, for sure, stay away from the aloha shirts. I always dress a long sleeve shirt, tie, and wear a jacket and get the jacket off as soon as I can. On holidays, after our Christmas, typically we're ready to start with the new year. We race into a country like Vietnam, middle of January, late part of January. We're ready to go. It's the new year. And then you look around and everything is shutting down. That's the Tet holiday. That's called stupidity, because they're going to be shut down for about a month. In your negotiations, emotion, don't do it. It'll backfire on you. You can't show angry. And then I guess one of the final comments I would say is that is a very sensitive area called the Viet Q, the overseas Vietnamese. And Betty will have a lot of comments, I think, on this. She has a slightly different perspective than I do. But basically, if you take the country of Vietnam from the south to the north, the further north you go, there is more prejudice against the Viet Q. And I have seen incredible, Viet Q would be overseas Vietnamese coming to do business in Vietnam. So Vietnamese Americans, as an example. Now, Betty will likely divide that Viet Q into two groups. One are called the yellow flaggers. Those are the ones who, don't want to have anything or respect to do with the current government and maintain the yellow flag of the old South Vietnam. And the others who are just coming to do business and work in the country. My experience has been that sometimes business people who are Vietnamese American encounter unnecessary discrimination against them because they are Viet Q. And that particularly as you go further north in the country, the preferences are they would rather do business with a non-Vietnamese. I have had this said to my face many times. And so the Viet Q issue is something that's very sensitive. Vietnam, by the way, is the only country that I know of in which you can go to where the US dollars actually work. You don't have to change currency, which you would have to do in Indonesia. You'd have to change your currency to rupiah. Let's shift to Indonesia now. Here's a piece that, a conversation that I had with Nainoa Thompson before the worldwide voyage started that caused Nainoa to agree to do a landing of the Hokulea on Bali in Indonesia. And that is this, and it's very important because you can take advantage of this, and that is that Indonesia is where the Polynesian roots flow through. And when it comes to business dress in Indonesia, again, conservative, you'll only be able to wear a jacket for a few minutes out in that heat, but long sleeve shirts. But here's the thing, for those of us in Hawaii, we have an advantage, and that is you can, as men, not women, men shift to the aloha shirt, long sleeve, and don't tuck it in, and it goes as the equivalent of the Indonesian batik shirt in business, and all of a sudden you are an Indonesian brother, an island brother, if you will. For women, even though you would see a lot of flashy clothes, sometimes the local women in the urban centers where, as a businesswoman, you need to have covered sleeves. Headscarf is not needed in Indonesia. And I think a more conservative dress or even pantsuits are okay in Indonesia. Now, remember that Indonesia is a very complex country. We're talking about 17,500 and change islands with different languages and different cultures. It is the largest Muslim majority country in the world, the fourth largest in the world by population, and it stretches out 6 time zones. And so you've got Hindus on Bali. In addition, you've got private Christian university on the outskirts of Jakarta run by the Lippo group of Chinese Indonesian heritage, the Riyadi group, and it takes 12 hours of flying time. I've never done it. I would not spend 12 hours in the inter-island planes, but 12 hours to fly from one end of Aceh in Sumatra all the way to Papua. And so it's if you see Indonesia imposed over the U.S. Mainland, it covers the length of the whole U.S. mainland, and I don't know why it takes so long to fly, but that's because there's no nonstop flights. One of the things in Indonesia that's frustrating that you need to know about is you, as a foreign business person, you need to be punctual for a meeting. They may not. And then in who you're doing business with, oh, this is a tricky one. It makes a difference whether you're dealing with an Indonesian of Malay descent Muslim, or whether you're dealing with an Indonesian of Chinese ethnicity who may or may not be Muslim, may be Christian. And the difference is the speed that they will do a deal. The Chinese move a lot faster. In the negotiations in Indonesia, in comparison with Vietnam, I would have to say the Indonesian negotiations are very slow moving. It's a very opaque process. And in order to kind of really appreciate what I'm saying, if you pull the old Mel Gibson movie, Year of Living Dangerously, off of Netflix, there's a whole scene in there about called the wayang. And those are the Indonesian puppets. And so the concept is what you see may just be the shadow, that may not be the real thing. And so the Indonesians with the wayang concept in their negotiations, it's a very opaque process, and they have a history of being a bit suspicious about foreigners. The American brand is improving. It doesn't carry the same firepower as it does in Vietnam, and so it'll take a little bit longer on the trust building. One of the tricky things about the negotiations with Indonesians is they rarely say no. And so you have to translate some of their phrases. And their favorite ones is when they say yes, but that's a no. Okay? When they say it might be difficult, that's a no. Here's one that's a no that is just a piece of body language. And you would see this in Korea as well. They'll go like this. Suck air through the teeth, that equals no. And the other one is the evasion of an answer. If they're dancing around and not giving you, the answer to your question, and you're working as gently as you can, but carefully, you're getting a no. They do a consensus style of negotiations, and they negotiate typically in very, very quiet tones. In this sense, they're very much like the Thais. And they have a lot of You see how awkward that was for you? You're Americans. You're all Americans. That is called audio slack time. And Americans cannot stand that. They have to fill it with every bit of noise possible for every second. But I gave you the demo. That's the way the Indonesians, they will have long pauses, audio slack time. Just be prepared for it. And they're very careful not to cause anyone to lose face. So even if you're making mistakes in what you're saying or it's wrong, they will not tell you because they don't want you to lose face. And so one big entertainment tip, if your spouse or significant other is invited to a business entertainment event in Indonesia, they do not plan to talk business. Just that's how it goes. Business gifts are a bit tricky. As a Muslim majority country, I would encourage you to stay away from alcohol and pork as a gift, even though it's very commonly consumed. And for heaven's sakes, when you're on Bali and the Hindu, let's not use the beef sticks, jerky. Again, let me repeat for women, no need headscarf. And I think that you'll see one other tip that's available, and that is if you go to export.gov, that website, export.gov, and you look up the country, whether it's Vietnam or Korea or Indonesia, any of these countries, you'll see a rather extensive white paper that's updated every couple of years by the U.S. Commercial Service. And that white paper, there's usually a section on cultural tips for doing business. It's updated. Again, it's helpful. It's not perfect. And I think that that's about all I've got time to cover here, to leave time for a couple of questions here.
Yeah, I'd like to leave questions generally till the end, but because David has to leave, does anybody have any particular questions about Indonesia or Vietnam?
If I can add to Vietnam.
Please.
Okay. If I may add to what David mentioned about Vietnam, since he mentioned my name so many times. Basically, I just want to clarify a few things that David said. The reason women have very prominent position in the Vietnamese society is because, in fact, the Vietnamese started out as a matriarchal society compared to some of the other Asian countries. And though, because they went through 1,000 years of domination by the Chinese, and therefore Confucianism is very strong in Vietnam, as well as other countries in Asia, so it's not just Vietnam. And therefore, publicly, the man gets to have the face and the, supposed to be the lead for the family. But privately in the family, it's the women that dominate. They control the finance of the family, and increasingly, they take a lot more public role in both government and business. There's many CEOs in Vietnam, as David mentioned, and so, and that has to do with that history. And the history is because the women that he mentioned, there are actually two sets of women. One is the two sisters, Hai Bai Chung. It's the husband of the oldest sister was a general. He was killed in battle, so she took up the lead, raised an army, and fought against the Chinese. And they did repulse the Chinese, but then they were defeated, and they committed suicide. Another woman called Bai Kieu, which similarly her husband was a general, and he was killed, so she took up the arms. And similarly, she was eventually defeated because the Chinese would bring down a huge army, and she was defeated, and she committed suicide because rather than be taken hostage. And because of that, the Vietnamese revered them, because not only they were very, they showed courage in fighting, but also they committed suicide rather than having humiliation and maybe worse things. And so both of those is a virtue in Vietnam, and because of that, they are revered. And therefore, women as a whole in society are revered in Vietnam. The mothers is always is sort of like the symbol of heroism in Vietnam, and I think China has the same kind of reverence for women. There's a strong ancestral worship in Vietnam, so the family, everything revolves around the family. Even under communism, family was very strong, and therefore, relationship within the family and the extended family is very important. Everybody have to have a place in society, and so the first thing they do is they will sort of categorize you, where you're going to fit before they guilt you.
Betty, can I interrupt you for a minute?
Sure.
I've got to go out the door, but one of the things that I think that is very, very powerful about what you just said, having to do with the Vietnamese woman, reminds me that in the Vietnamese culture today, in certain parts of the country, there are some slang sayings about doing business that come back, and I only remember one of them. But and maybe you can translate it into Vietnamese. But one of the sayings goes back to the so-called American War, and there was a Vietnamese lady general combat that was decorated at one point by Ho Chi Minh by the name of Madame Utic.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And one of her expressions that has become passed down through the ages that you hear in business is that, and of course it's a wartime expression, but it has something to do with a cultural attitude, is that in English, the translation is, we will fight them down to the last shred of clothing on our bodies. Do you remember that?
I honestly don't know the exact Vietnamese expression, but yes, Vietnamese are very belligerent in that sense. Throughout history, they conquered so many countries around them. So that's the American, just one of them. And in fact, my first trip back to Vietnam, and this is related to that Viet Kieu experience that David mentioned. The reason the Vietnamese are so anti-Viet Kieu is because the first overseas Vietnamese that came back, they were original refugees who left the country, And so already a lot of Vietnamese felt they abandoned the country during time of stress. But then they came back, and having made it in the West, they tried to show off with jewelry and everything you can think of to show their wealth, that they did so well. Meanwhile, the country was still poor when they first opened to the West. And therefore, there's a lot of resentment against these Viet Kieu who came back trying to dominate, trying to do this, do that. But people like me who left when I was only 7, actually I left North Vietnam when I was 3. When I went back, and I still speak Vietnamese fluently, I still have the manners of the Vietnamese because I was always raised very traditionally by my family. Actually, I have double the appreciation from the Vietnamese when I came back. But I always remember my first meeting when I went to the Central Bank of Vietnam to visit them on behalf of Chemical Bank. They found out that my husband had come back a few months before me just to scout out to make sure that everything's okay before I came back. And so the director of foreign business said, "Oh, you didn't come back with your husband because you were afraid we would arrest you, right?" Because this was a rumor that the Viet Kieu spread around. And he said, why would we worry about it? Because, we defeat the Chinese, we defeat the French, and we defeat the Americans. So, it's not a big deal. So, war's over, we're friends again, and everything's fine. And anyhow, we don't have enough money to put everybody in prison. So that's the attitude they have. It's very practical. They want to do business. They want to, get the country. If there's resentment at all, they keep it to themselves. They keep it within the family. But everything is like, we move on, we're going to do business, right? So that's, and they will always try to become friends with with people that they deal business with. So if they haven't established a relationship with you, they're going to become friends as they do business with you, because that's how they feel comfortable about doing it. One last thing that I would say about the Vietnamese thing that you have to be careful about is that people in Vietnam, opposite sex do not hold hands in public, even if they're husband and wife. But same sex, they may do it, because this is how friends are. So the girls in high school or college or whatever, they will hold hands. Same with the guys. It doesn't mean they're gay. It just means this is the way they express their friendship to each other. And so when you see that, you should not say, oh, there's a lot of homosexuals in Vietnam or whatever. Now, as they become more westernized and they learn the taboos in the West, they will avoid some of that because they don't want people to think they're, gay or homosexual. But definitely, it is something that's still practiced to this day. So I'm going to leave that.
I had a couple questions. Maybe David could have addressed this as well. First off, as a Viet Kieu, are you now able to purchase land or real estate? I know previously it was reserved strictly for the Vietnamese that are citizens, but I think the laws have been changed.
If you go and live in Vietnam, you can buy land, and even as a foreigner. But if you are living overseas, they will not have you do that. So a lot of the Viet Kieu, what they do is they use their relative's name and buy the properties.
And then the other, on that note, can you establish a company, and if you partner in with a Vietnamese company, that they would hold 51% ownership and you 49% ownership, and you can engage in making the purchase, or is that something that's not upheld?
Well, if it's under the company's name, you can. But be careful when they are 51% and you're 49%, because they will have the voting and they can outvote you. So be careful who the partner is.
Okay, then one last question is I've been there several times now, and the way we would exchange our dollars to dong was going to jewelry stores. And so because there's not many foreign currency exchange booths that we've seen, say like in Thailand and so on, is that a safe way to do exchange of currency, or is it best to go to the banks where you might get less dongs for your dollar?
Honestly, they still allow a lot of things to happen there, even when it's quasi-illegal. So it's safe to do it. It's just that the exchange rate will be different depending on where you exchange, and some people may give you better rate than others. It's very small difference. So, but I don't want to keep answer your question because I think we would like to move on and then have the question answered at the end.
Yeah, please, if you don't mind. Anyway, thank you for that excellent discussion. I think those are two countries, Indonesia and Vietnam, that we're going to hear a lot more about in the coming years. They're stable, politically stable countries with young populations that and a growing middle class. They are not small countries population-wise. I just believe that those two countries are going to be increasingly important to Hawaii in the next several years. So let's keep an eye on that. Next, I'd like to talk about Korea with Bill Oberlin. But Bill, I have a small request from the videographer. He would like you to move over here if you don't mind.
Sure.
Because he's getting a lot of noise from that air conditioner up there. Sorry about that. I know it's better to sit next to Brenda than it is to me. Okay, Bill Oberlin is going to talk about Korea, but I'd like to bring up a slide that he had. If I may. Please go ahead, Bill.
The slide actually was a draft of a proposal we put together for a doing business in Korea, or actually how business is done in Korea. And it raised some questions which are would have been part of the presentation. And I was just trying to use it as thought-provoking. However, listening to the discussions on Indonesia and Vietnam, I took a bunch of notes, and mainly to try to do some comparisons between Korea and what you just heard. First of all, I first went to Korea about 30 years ago, so a lot of what I have seen in Korea is more of an evolution of the business culture. First, you got to remember, first of all, how many people have been to Korea? Raise your hand, please. Oh, many. Okay, I should just switch to questions right now. Anyway, as you know, we've got 28,000 U.S. troops there. It's an extremely important trading partner with the United States. There's a free trade agreement we call CORUS. I worked long and hard on that and getting it passed. And yes, I believe that there are probably some changes that need to be made in the free trade agreement, mainly in the area of implementation. But it should not be cast aside because of the fact that the Koreans have lots of things they would like to see change in it too. North Korea, similar to what you heard about Vietnam, even though it's on everybody's lips right now, when I was in Korea, we went through many cycles of I guess you could say, antagonism. Is it a point of discussion with your Korean friends or partners? Not really. If they bring it up, yes. If you bring it up, it would be probably a little extraordinary, so I would suggest you don't. You may have heard that you can think of Koreans as the Irish of Asia. They have a lot of similar type of traits. They're poets. They're very emotional. You'll find that out. You may find that out. Over 50% of the population is Christian. At night, when you're driving around, take a look off the highway, and you'll see a sea of crosses because there are thousands of churches, and every single one of them usually has a lit cross on top. I don't have it too. I'm lost. As far as resources are concerned, the usual resources are there: United States government, Foreign Commercial Service, American Chamber of Commerce. Almost every, for example, if you're looking for a law firm, you're looking for a consultant, you're looking for somebody who's already doing business in Korea and you would like to find out just what it's like, AmCham is a good reference. The Korean law firms all have the big ones, all have American partners. They don't practice law. They're really kind of business consultants, but they're an excellent resource. As far as dress is concerned, formal. Wear a coat and tie. I mean, in 30 years, it's very rare that I spend a lot of time super casual. And when you do go casual, make it resort casual. Ladies, same thing. Holidays, right now is a bad time to visit Korea because everybody is on vacation. End of July, August is not a good time to go. The rest of the time, except for Chuseok, their Thanksgiving, which usually is lunar calendar, comes up in about the September, early October timeframe. That's another time where people take off. Other than that, it's just about wide open. The reference to overseas Koreans, or in that case, the overseas Vietnamese, that used to be the case, but it is no longer the case because we've gone from the original Kyopo, the Koreans that moved overseas in the 60s, for example. Now we're into first generation and second generation. There's very little stigma attached to that. And I can't read my writing. First question there, why is somebody frowning at my business card? Yes, first of all, make sure you have business cards. Even if you don't have them translated, make sure you have business cards because like Japan and other locations, they expect it and they're going to give you one. If you do have it translated, and speaking of translators, make sure you have good translators. The very first time I went to Korea, I was making a presentation on a sale of Chinook helicopters to the Korean Army. And it had been translated by a translation company in Washington, D.C. As I got about halfway through it, all the officers started laughing. And I stopped and said, I'm sorry, what's so funny? It said, up there, it says the Korean for swash plate. And I said, well, what does it say? It says dinner plates in a stream. I said, how do you say in Korean swash plate? They said swash plate. You'll find that Koreans are taught English in middle school and high school. And even though they may not practice it, almost everybody has a modicum of English capability. Today, that's even more than a modicum. So you're going to find English spoken, and from a business point of view, you're really not going to have much trouble. But going back, if you believe that you need a translator, make sure you get a good translator. And bringing a translator from the United States, make sure you vet them first. The best thing to do is get somebody local. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. 2 points here. Back in the old days, you had to be extremely careful. Today, you have to be extremely careful also. But on the other hand, what you've seen in Korea is a lot of what we insist upon as American companies and Americans doing business overseas. The Koreans are doing and setting in place the same type of regulations. So I'm not saying don't worry about it, be conscious of it. If you have any questions, contact a lawyer. And as I said, the law firms in Korea have American expats that have been there many of them have been there for like 40 or 50 years. So they're very trustworthy. Yes. The second place, they may mention, you go out to dinner, and should you pay for it? In Korean custom, if they invite you to dinner, they're supposed to pay for it. However, from an American point of view, and especially the fact you're trying to establish a business or sell something or whatever, offer to pay for it. Be aware that it can be very, very expensive. If they say, let's go to a second place, that's normally what we would call, let's go karaoke. You may hear the terminology room salons. If you hear room salon, there's going to be women involved. Be aware of that. There's a lot of drinking. I won't say that Korea has a drinking problem, but they do consume a lot of alcohol, and you would be expected to do the same. However, the good news is they all are very conscious of health. So if you want to weigh out, which is not going to offend anybody, just say that I really can't drink very much because in my case I'm too old and I can't do it, or just come up with an excuse and it will be accepted. But I would still go along to the first place. Excuse me, the second place. We had dinner first. Second place. If you hear third place or fourth place, I would say you gotta leave. A lot takes place at night. Business takes place at night. Relationships are established at night. And as David said, for example, in negotiating, a good part of it is the interpersonal relationship that is developed between both sides. That does not mean that forget about writing a contract, because true, back in the old days, contracts and lawyers meant nothing, because it is it was a society that really, if you ever ended up in court, the relationship is gone forever, and you may be gone forever as far as that particular industry is concerned. That's no longer the case. Rule of law is much more important today than it was, but the contract still is based upon the relationship between both sides. Korean food, you can get excellent Korean food here in Honolulu. If you've never had it, go try it so you know what you're going to get into when you go there. Are they going to perhaps push your limit as far as what you're eating? Perhaps, but I don't expect. But if your food is moving, then they're pushing the limit.
Yes.
My rule was that I would never eat something that was trying to kill me at the same time.
Like fish.
My negotiator is a woman. Actually, we had on the F-15, no, on the 737 AEW AWACS program, our lead negotiator was a lady, and there was no problem whatsoever. And I'm sure that's still today. Is it a male-dominated society? Yes, it is. But women, we just had a lady president. The Minister of Foreign Affairs is a lady in Korea right now. You're going to find there's less of the macho element in Korea than what was there a long time ago. As far as the question that was in here about the newspaper, I think the answer there is go to the lawyer. Again, Korean lawyer. Because actually, from my own personal experience, we had that happen to us, the Boeing company, several times in Korea. And some of the law firms like Kim and Chung, they were able to take care of it for us. Because surprisingly enough, there are a lot of laws now that are similar to what you find in the United States as far as slander, et cetera, et cetera. Now, contrary to what you'll find in Indonesia, the business about the last one where your counterpart nickname was John Wayne, actually we ran into a situation where the Korean negotiator, his nickname was the Duke, so I call him John Wayne. They will not, if they want to tell you no, they'll tell you no. And if they want to beat up on you, they will beat up on you. And verbally, too, especially if he's very accomplished in the English language. But at the end of at the end of the day, it's expected that when you walk out, you're friends. What goes on in the negotiating room goes on in the negotiating room. When you walk into it, remember a couple things. Their idea is that they're going to give you enough time to come to their position. So use time to your benefit. The second one is that again, interpersonal relationships are very important. If they act like they're angry, don't get angry. In other words, play the game. And third, make sure that you don't walk in with your bottom line position, because part of the game is that they are going to extract something from you. And so that's a giveaway. So make sure you got a giveaway when you walk in a door. Gifts, that was brought up. For men, you can't really go wrong with anything related to golf, because they're golfing fanatics. And so golf is always a good one. But Hawaii is too. When I first went to Korea, it was extremely rare that anybody under the age of, I forget, about 35 was even permitted to have a passport. It all had to do with the loss of funds. Anyway, that's changed. They love to travel. And more than likely, when you go there, you're going to be talking to somebody who has been to Hawaii. So my point is, a gift that you would give them related to Hawaii is always well received. I think I got everything that I had scribbled on my piece of paper. So at some point in time, if you all have questions, I'd be more than happy to try to answer them.
I'll add a couple quick points about Korea. I found that it's one of the countries in the world that I've spent a lot of time in, that if you have any problem with secondhand smoke, you're going to have a big problem in Korea, because there's still a tremendous amount of smoking going on there. And it's just a very common thing if you're in a meeting, whether it's a negotiation or not just a sales meeting. People will take a break and have to go out and have a cigarette and come back. They'll invite you along. They don't care if you smoke or not. You can easily say, no, I don't smoke. That's fine. That's no problem at all. But if you go out to dinner, if you go out drinking, for sure, even people who don't normally smoke start smoking, right? So you just got to be ready for that. I would agree with what Bill said about dressing rather formally. The suits, you have to have a suit. There's just no question about that. Whether it's summer or not, the Korean summer is extremely hot and humid, and the Korean winter is extremely cold and windy. But nonetheless, you should have a full suit, probably darker colors, what have you. I think business women from Hawaii should dress pretty conservatively and get there. And I think the more conservative you look, the more professional it appears to them. I don't think you need translators. There were times years ago when you probably could, but now it's not really necessary, especially in Seoul. What else would I add? I would say I agree with everything that Bill said about the Koreans are extremely emotional people, right? It's actually quite a dichotomy, or quite different from Japan. If you go on the same business trip to Japan and then to Korea, it's really quite a remarkable difference. Still the same amount of alcohol and smoke, but on the other hand, as Bill said, the Koreans are really the poets, and you feel that from both the men and the women. But I found that you can make tremendously loyal, extremely long-term, lifelong sort of friends and colleagues in Korea, both from just people that you work with and customers. You can have fantastic long-term relationships with customers in Korea. People you will meet who will be very concerned about you personally, your company, the health of your company, making sure everybody's around for the long term. I think that it's really fantastic, and it's a language that you can learn.
Yes.
It sounds complicated, but it's actually easy to learn how to read. You just have to put in the effort. but it's not kanji or the Chinese character-based language necessarily. That it's pretty straightforward with a dictionary and just some practice at home. You can learn how to read Korean
In 24 hours.
Yeah,
It's very easy.
Yeah. I had to do that when I was very young. My first job out of university sent me to live in Korea, and I had no idea what I was doing there. But there I was, and I had to learn all of these things. But it was great. I mean, cutting my teeth in business in Korea was fantastic because I learned, as Bill said, that in negotiations, they will beat you up. They're very rough in negotiations, but if you can survive that, you can survive anything. And as Bill also said, that I agree with 100%, you just keep your composure and smile through it and try your best. And at the end of the day, it all works out. And you will have a very good customer. You do have to negotiate. If you have a price list, a lot of companies will have sort of their main price list, but then they have their Korean price list that they discount from. That's just the way it is. You have to discount, and as Bill said, you have to have a giveaway when you go there. So just sort of know that ahead of time, because you cannot let the purchaser or the purchasing department not have a discount. It's impossible in Korea. You cannot be that company that says, I never give away a discount, or we don't discount. Well, then you're not going to do business in Korea. You might as well go home.
The Koreans always insisted a paragraph in our contracts that says that we will never sell this product to anybody else at a lower price than what we just sold it to you. Now, our lawyers wanted to make that to include the moon, but we always signed up to it because we knew, for all intents and purposes, if we're going to sell it to Korea, we're not going to be able to sell it to anybody else at a lower price. The other thing I forgot to mention too, when you meet somebody or introduce to somebody, unlike in other countries in Asia where they bow, in Korea you may lower your head a little bit, but you're really not bowing. However, when you shake hands, with your right hand, of course, you take your left hand and put it someplace in here. I usually put it very close to my wrist, and that's a sign of deference. And they will do the same thing to you.
It's a very interesting thing, actually. When you're pouring something, like if I was pouring this drink for Bill, I would, first of all, I'd stand up a little bit, and the weight of the job that I'm doing, pouring this drink for him, is so difficult that I should
And see what I'm doing too?
hold my arm up a little bit. You'll see them do that a lot, and the sooner you pick up on that, the better it is for you, because it makes it look like you're trying to. Please.
Yeah, I was just curious, years ago, there was a lot of sensitivities between the relationships in Japan and Korea. Has that changed at all?
As a foreigner who spent a lot of time in both and married to one half of the equation, I would say no, it's still there, for
Yes.
sure.
I'm married to a Korean, and it sometimes pops up.
Yeah, especially once they start drinking. It just happens. It's just the way it is. I would leave it at that. I would say Korea is a great place to work, great place to do business. It is relatively straightforward. You will meet a lot of Koreans who have been educated in the U.S. or know a lot about the U.S. or lived in the U.S. You know, you can't assume every person you meet on the street in Korea is just sort of a Korean person born and raised in Seoul and lived there their whole life, because you'll meet people working, I don't know, a bus driver who went to school in, grew up in Irvine or something. I mean, it's just so fluid like that, the movement between the U.S. and Korea, that you just can't assume anything there. And they won't tell you that when you go into a negotiation, for example, that the guy you're sitting across the table with grew up in Peoria. You know, they want you to just think he grew up somewhere in the south of Korea, in Busan or somewhere, right? But he could have grown up in Honolulu for all you know. And they won't tell you that at the beginning, but it's quite common.
We had a lawyer one time sitting on the Korean government side of the table, that kept his mouth shut, occasionally would whisper, and we found out later on he was a first lieutenant and graduate of Harvard Law School.
Yeah. My final comment about Korea would be that to my knowledge or my experience, there's not a country that's more proud of itself and its culture, and you'll hear that a lot from them, and I think they have it's reasonable for them to be proud. Every country should be proud of their culture, but I just think Koreans sort of go the extra limit, and they'll constantly point out to you as a foreigner these things that are interesting about Korea, and the more that you can take part in that, whether it's the food or the alcohol or the architecture or the poetry or whatever, the more that you can take part in all of that, the more that they will appreciate you. And so I strongly advise you to do that. Just as Bill said, if your food is moving, well, try it. At least
Stab it.
somehow it's fun. Actually, it's actually quite fun. But it's very good, and in fact, Korean food is one of my favorites of all time. Everybody knows. Okay, we'll move on from Korea. If we can, let's jump into China.
China or Japan?
China, I think, if we can.
Okay.
Because we'll counteract with Japan.
Oh, you're going to counteract. Now you can see the politics coming out among the group. I want to do a little bit different. You're going to hear some similarities, but I'd like to contrast a little bit between Chinese and U.S. business values and what the culture is like. You've heard several of the people talk about relationships. That's extremely important in China. The term that many of you who are familiar with China, or if you're not, the term is guanxi. And in China, it really is about interpersonal relationships, and that it is the relationship that comes first. In the United States, it's not the relationship. Generally, it's the economics or the business that comes first. But for China, you may need to take several trips to be able to develop the trust and the respect and to be able to really get that relationship with the partner with whom you want to do business. And it's very important on another aspect to have humility. In China, humility is considered a virtue. You really need to have a sensitivity and be able to understand and listen to others. In the United States, humility generally speaking, is considered a sign of weakness in business because there's every reason to be proud of your company and all of its achievements and everything that you may have accomplished to attain your position within your company. But that would be frowned upon in China. So you need to be, if you're an American doing business in China, you need to be a good listener. And you need to observe. And when you respond to the Chinese, I think you need to have less tacit responses to them. There's the rules, the respect of rules in China. Generally speaking, this is changing, but generally speaking, there's not much respect for rules. And the Chinese are always trying to find a way, I won't say to break the rules to get competitive or get an advantage, but there's always a way around something. And for example, contracts. Contracts in China are really the beginning of the negotiation. So in the United States, or for U.S. business, we like to play by the rules. Everything is black and white. We negotiate. We have a contract. We have a scope of services. And we say, okay, this is the way it's going to be. Well, in China, everything's a negotiation. And it's always a negotiation. And it's a continuing negotiation. So if you have a contract signed and you think you're ready to, proceed, well, in essence, for the Chinese, that contract is really just the beginning of the negotiation. Because something's going to come up and they'll say, and you might point to, oh, it's in the contract, and they'll say, oh, no, we're going to discuss that. We put it there because we agreed that we would discuss it. One person had told me, who's actually in this room and uses this a lot, that if you need something that's really black and white, doing business in China is really not for you. If you can function in a gray area and be very flexible. Now, gray area does not mean illegal. It does not mean going against Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, but it means flexibility and the ability to adapt. Then China might be a place for you for business. There's a sense of planning in the difference of the Chinese and American cultures. Chinese are generally, in terms of meetings, setting up schedules, and if you're wanting to know what you will be doing there when you arrive in China, they're very casual about time. You know, they'll get to it. It's almost there, or they'll get to it, and you might be getting very frustrated because for Americans, we're good planners, generally speaking. We respect the calendar, we like things detailed, and we like things scheduled. Well, the Chinese, it takes a while. They might be busy or somebody may not be available. And generally speaking, for I think my 40-plus career with China, I would know what my schedule was when I arrived in China. Or when I lived and worked in China, I would know what my schedule would be when I lived in Shanghai. So whether when I touched down in Beijing, Chengdu, or Chongqing, or Guangzhou, I was always greeted very professionally, and when I arrived, that's when I was handed my schedule, and I would know who I would be meeting with, who I would be negotiating with, and who may or may not have been added or deleted from the schedule that we may have requested. But there is one difference on time with China. They may be casual in their sense of planning, but when it comes to an event or a dinner or the time the meeting has been set, you need to be very punctual. In fact, you should get there a little ahead of time, not too far ahead of time so as to embarrass the hosts or your negotiators, but you need to be there on time, and very much on time. And if it's a social event, for example, like a banquet, if you're going to a banquet that the Chinese are hosting, again, you need to arrive on time, but more importantly, you leave a little early. So once the banquet is done, you leave first. Maybe early is the wrong term, but you leave a little early and you leave first. If you are hosting the banquet, then you get there at least 30 minutes ahead of time, at least. I found, depending where we were working in China, whether it was Shanghai or whatever city we were in, I would try to get there at least an hour ahead of time, because something was either not quite right, because everything, there's a term, another term in Chinese, chabuduo, you know, it's almost. Well, for Americans, almost means it's not good enough. And for me, it wasn't. I wanted it perfect because of whatever we were trying to do. So I would go in, or my staff would be with me, and I would go in and we would chat, and very nicely, because we didn't want anybody to lose face. Face is a huge concept, and you don't want anybody to lose face. But you would go in and then discuss with them what you might want changed or what might needed to be done. So that is the one difference on time. But what you need to do when you go into those meetings, you need to be patient. Like the other cultures, do not show emotion. I mean, the Chinese are not emotional like the Koreans or others. You may have no idea what they're thinking. And one thing you don't do in negotiations right off the bat, until you really know people and you're really working on something, never talk about deadlines. Don't go into a meeting right away, sit down, not listen, and say, you know, I got a deadline, or we've got to get this deal negotiated, because you just don't do that. Negotiating with the Chinese is a long-term process. And like others, or you said in Korea you don't need translators. In China you need translators. Yes, do people speak English? In some areas. In like Korea and the others, all of the American Fortune 500 companies are there, SMEs are there, the American accountants and law firms are there. But like in Korea and the rest, they can't practice law, they advise in the legal aspect, but they work with Chinese law firms. And increasingly, the Chinese law firms are really excellent. They're multinational in nature. They have a lot of their lawyers have studied and gone to law schools abroad, either in the United States or in Europe. They've practiced for U.S. law firms, and they have returned home. So they are very good. And yes, you will need them because they will be, either the accountants and or the law firms will be the most up-to-date on the rules, laws, and regulations in China, which are constantly changing, not enforced, and very opaque, and very little transparency. So you really need somebody who is in that field, native Chinese, who can work with you. But you want your own translator, and I like Bill, you want that person vetted. The translators that I would use would either be on my staff or would be some that we had hired that actually were from the Chinese government. One lady in particular that I would use when I could get her was the #1 translator for the mayor of Shanghai. She was superb. And the reason for this is, even though I spoke Chinese and understood Chinese, it gives you time in negotiations to think and to listen to what the other person is saying, and to making sure that you're getting the right interpretation of what you might be discussing or negotiating. And it's always advisable to buy time in those meetings and to be able to listen and listen and listen, and then also look at the body language of the people in the room. So that brings us to the meetings and what really commands respect. And that is seniority, background, expertise, wisdom, and wealth. And always in a Chinese negotiation, it'll be the highest ranking member who will be the leader of the delegation. But that person may not be the decision maker. And the decision maker in the room may be seated at the other end of the table, and you may think that that individual is just quiet or is just a staff person, when indeed that really is the decision maker. He may be a party person, he may be somebody involved with the company, but it'll be that individual. It won't necessarily be the highest ranking member. However, you need to have have some deference, and you need to work and negotiate together with that person, which is one of the reasons I think it's always advisable in terms of doing your due diligence before you go to China and when you're on the ground in China, to have really good staff, especially Chinese staff with you, who could develop those relationships past that senior level, because that was actually how I would find out what was really going on and what people were thinking and what I thought we might be able to negotiate on behalf of the American companies that we were representing. And that is very important. You need to find out from within the organization, almost within the bowels of the organization, what they're thinking and the way they want to go. But what commands respect with regard to U.S. culture is usually success, achievement, and wealth. And that's not what it is with China, per se. So you have to be, again, very careful in going into those negotiations. And then we look at work-life boundaries and balance. In China, it's pretty much, a sacrifice of life to work. I have never seen people work such incredibly long hours, even though they have families. They have very little work-life balance. That's changing a bit with, I would say, the younger generation, and I put that, the people in their maybe mid to late 30s. Betty may have something on that. She might want to do that. But with regard to the United States, unless you're maybe a young associate attorney starting out, work-life balance is important. Privacy is important. And we like to respect the boundaries of others. And that's probably becoming increasingly more so, especially if we look at our generations of people. But that's not necessarily true in China. And then we have the cultural thing of the strong versus the weak. In China, it's really not righteous, and I'll use that term for the Chinese, to bully people, to try to strong-arm people. What's important is saving face. In United States business culture, it's about competition. It's an honor to win. And that if you're weak, you're going to get preyed upon by the strong. That is not what you can do in China. But one should never underestimate the Chinese as ever being weak whatsoever. They are strong, they are resolute, and they know exactly what they want. So it's more of an attitude, and you have to watch that attitude, I think, when you're working with them or go in with that. And then the other one is about a tolerance of diversity and an openness to alternative ideas. Outwardly, the Chinese are usually very receptive, but in reality, actually less so, I think, because they have too many constraints. They may have constraints from the organization, constraints within the party. Most of all of the companies down I'm seeing, even with regard to the SOEs, state-owned enterprises and large companies that are wanting to list or being listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, where the party from Beijing, the Communist Party, is putting a very heavy hand on them now and putting in on all of these companies, even those on the stock exchange. They are putting in party committees within the company now. So people are concerned on those party committees who's going to really run the organization. So where your young people and those that you're working with they've traveled, they've been out, they have innovative ideas, and they might want to say that's going to be great. I can see them going back into the room where the real decision maker is, and they're saying, no, the idea is too Western. That's kind of not where we want to go right now. And that's where we are seeing currently happening in China. In the United States, our cultural values are much more open. We're much more open to ideas, creativity, the innovation, and I think we're much more tolerant of what we might want to do in terms of diversity in business. We have the idea of shame and humiliation. I think it's important to note that Chinese have a long memory. And they have also the need and the urge to exonerate. It's not like Korea, when you leave a room, if somebody got angry in that room or people showed too much emotion, that the Chinese are going to walk out of that room and we're all going to be friends and forget about it. That isn't going to happen. Trust me, that isn't going to happen with the Chinese. Very long memories. With U.S., our priorities in terms of shame or humiliation tend to be superseded by our business priorities. We go in or we're about business. This is what we're doing. This is what it is. This isn't personal. This is business. You're not going to find that with the Chinese. It is not necessarily about business. Remember, it goes back to the relationship, the guanxi, the respect, the trust that you're somebody with whom they can work. Their priorities, the cultural priorities in terms of doing business in China, are generally mixed. They're about business, they're individual, they can be factional, they can be nationalistic, and they can be political. And at least in my experience, it has usually been that they process information really through a subjective perspective based on experience, based on their relationship with you, based on maybe what their friends or other people have said about you. In other words, with regard to the U.S., we can do business with people we don't like because it's business. In China, maybe, but they really want to trust you, work with you, and like you. I think it's important when you look at decision-making in China, and I've looked at this even with regard to the new free enterprise zones around China, where, the businesses are really experimenting with business, they say, without or free from party control or the Communist Party control. Actually, that's not the case. I find the Chinese still very much have a collective way of thinking. Now, you have a lot of entrepreneurs in China that I could say if I take the Chinese entrepreneurs, the Chinese Entrepreneur Club, and the types of things that they're doing, yes, they're experimenting, yes, they're doing things, But there still is, regardless of whether it's local, provincial, or at the national level, there's still a bit of a heavy hand on what's acceptable and how far one can go and what you can really do. We've talked about, and other people mentioned about business cards. Business cards for the culture are very important. And again, it's important, if at all possible, that they are in both Chinese and in English. But make sure when you put them into Chinese that you have somebody who can really translate for you your name, or if they're translating your company name. I have found increasingly, however, at least even with my business cards, I would put in, I was the president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, I would put in what that was in Chinese, so I would put in all of that. My Chinese name is an actual Chinese name, not a transliteration of my English name, but an actual Chinese name, so that resonated with the Chinese. And when you present the business card, you always hear, and you'll hear it, I think, across cultures, that you present with two hands. You know, you stand up and you present with two hands. And then you accept the other card with two hands. But again, when you get that business card, because maybe some of us want to make sure that we remember who this individual is or what these meetings were, and may make a horrible mistake of in front of people writing on that business card. Never, never, when you're given a Chinese business card, write on that business card. You have a piece of paper or a notepad or something else that you write on. In addition, and I have seen this, which again is not very good, if you're given a business card, and I notice sometimes, this is more true with men than women, because men will pull out their wallets. They might have business cards in their wallet. They'll hand the business card over. They'll take the business card that they've been given, put it in their wallet, put it in their pocket, and then sit on it. Huge faux pas. Huge faux pas. Never do that. Put those business cards either in a nice business card folder, put it in your suit pocket or coat pocket, but don't put it in your wallet, and put your wallet in your pocket and sit on it. That would be extremely disrespectful for what we would be doing. There are a lot of other things we could go into. I know Betty, I've asked Betty to talk a little bit also on China, on some of the other aspects, but I wanted to at least cover those, and we could handle a lot during a question-answer session. So thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. Betty, do you have any comments?
Yes,
about China?
I will just add a few comments. I did live in China for 2 years, actually in the early years of China, so the 1980 to 82, when it was very much under communism, very strong communist rule. And then I lived in Hong Kong for 21 years, working there as well. And Hong Kong, of course, as you know, is now part of China. It was under the British. So I'm going to talk a little bit about China, adding to what Brenda has just mentioned, and then kind of contrast a little bit about what's happening in Hong Kong. Although they are Chinese, but they have sort of grown separately for 99 years. The Guanxi concept, as Brenda mentioned, is extremely important. I would say of all the Asian countries, that's probably something that people really look at as sort of the driver for all of their relationship with you. So it could mean that they don't look at the bottom line as much as some of the other countries. I mean, I have come to, I have done business throughout Asia because I was head of international banking at Bank of Hawaii. But then prior to that, when I was in Hong Kong, various business that I managed covered all of Asia. In China, even if you don't give them the best price, they may still deal with you rather than with a competitor just because of the relationship. In a place like Japan, for example, nowadays more and more they're driven by the bottom line. So yes, they have a great relationship with you, but if your price is different or not as competitive as your competitor, they're going to give it to the competitor. They will apologize, but they'll give it to the competitor. So that's a difference in terms of Guanxi relationship in China and other countries. And it is very long-term. I mean, I now no longer cover the foreign markets under Merrill Lynch, and yet a lot of my former contact in China and, still to this day, when they come to Hawaii, they still try to reach out to me and invite me for dinner. Just as a social thing, just as friends, rather than, we have to do business with her. So the guanxi, the friendship is so important. The punctuality for events, that is so true, because we have had many events where literally the Chinese make sure they come on time, and yet at other time where it drives us nuts because we can't get appointment until we get to China. And if you bring a senior, your CEO to China for a visit, and you can't get the appointment confirmed until you arrive, it does drive the CEO mad because it's like, okay, so who am I going to see the next day, right, or whatever. And that is the contrast, the difference between, again, China and other places. Now, coming to the work-life boundary, and that's very, very important in that the Chinese tend to work very long hours and very hard. And Hong Kong is exact same way. There's a bit of that, and maybe not so much in China anymore, more so in Hong Kong still. They don't want to leave before the boss does. So even they're not doing anything, they're going to stay around because somehow it's a bad reflection to leave before the boss. And so they will stay till 8, 9, 10 p.m., whatever, because the boss is still around, even if that person may have a personal reason why they're staying around. And that is sort of changing because the younger people are more westernized now. They do get exposed to the West. They see how Americans work and European works, and they start adopting some of that and don't feel as guilty about, leaving earlier or, not working long hours. So Hong Kong, I think, Brenda had literally covered everything. She's done so much in China. Everything she says is on the dot, basically. Didn't touch on women, which, as you know, women really are in a lot of business in China. They dominate universities. In fact, some of the top graduates in Chinese university are women, not the men. And certainly that means when they go out in business, they really manage a lot of the companies and the departments and so on. So they're very strong in China. And there is no discrimination that I can think of in China for against women, whereas Japan, Korea, actually, there is still that discrimination for women. So there is that very strong segment of the population, increasingly, that's running the country. Not the government so much
Right.
as the businesses. Hong Kong is a lot more westernized because it had that strong British influence. And they pride themselves in being westernized and then knowing how to deal with the foreigners. They accept the foreigners a little bit more readily, although they still have, they do have a lot of discrimination against the foreigners. They still call them Wailo, which means foreign devils. And that could mean anything. Doesn't have to be, I'm a Wailo too, because I'm not Chinese. I'm not Hong Kong Chinese, right? And to a certain extent, they even discriminate against mainland Chinese coming down to Hong Kong. So even though Hong Kong is part of China, yet they strive very hard, at least the people, to remain independent. And they have not fully accept the fact that they are now under China rule and therefore should really be, towing the line of Beijing. As you remember, there was that big movement, the umbrella movement, they call it, because they were in disagreement about the election of the chief executive of Hong Kong. Because under the agreement that they had when Hong Kong went back to China, it was supposed to be that at some stage they were going to have free election. Well, yes, it's free election, except that the candidates have to be pre-vetted by Beijing, and there was that disagreement. Now, you could say under the British, they had no election. Everything was appointed by the British government. And so already they have a lot of free election right now, but they're still not too happy about that because there's the constituency that really elect them. And so there's some pre-selection process before the candidates are really being voted on by people. But to a certain extent, if you go to Hong Kong, you would never think of it as being part of China. There's a border between Hong Kong and China, so the Chinese cannot just come down to Hong Kong freely. They still have to have a visa to come down because the Chinese government did not want Hong Kong to be overwhelmed by this influx of Chinese. But there are more and more Chinese companies allowed to set up business in Hong Kong. And so it is, it's one of those kind of contradictory thing where they don't want a lot of Chinese to go down, but yet they want the Chinese money to come to Hong Kong, to invest in Hong Kong and support Hong Kong because they want Hong Kong to remain strong. Not only because it's part of China, but it's still the kind of the gateway to dealing with the West. And China likes to maintain Hong Kong semi-independent because then it has a second voice to help China. And so the people in Hong Kong are very proud of that. They are very proud of the fact that they think of themselves as being independent and they behave accordingly. So they will deal with you more straightforwardly, more westernized way than, let's say, in China. Chinese, because of all the restriction in China, they try to get around the rule. In Hong Kong, they don't do so much of that. They do follow the rule. The legal infrastructure is much more solid because it is still managed or run by the British system. So the court system is still, as far as I know, is still in English language with translation. So all of these, defendants who come to court, they are local. They have to go through a translator because their attorneys are going to argue everything in English. And so it's still not 100%, under China, so to speak. So that's probably, all I have to add on that. There's all of these other things about giving. There are taboos with numbers, like number 4 is a definite no-no because Su means also, if you phonetically, sounds like death. And so people don't give anything that's 4. They don't give clock for the same reason because clock means death as well. And then there are colors like blue color and white color and black color are funeral colors. Right. People wear blue for funeral and they wear white or black, depending on the religions or the practice. And so people don't give gift wrapped in blue, white, or black color, for example. And the flowers, again, you don't give white flowers and things like that because it is a death color. Although, yet the brides are wearing white right now in Hong Kong for marriage. But then in the banquet, they would change into red and pink and so on for the banquet. So there is, again, the balance between the traditions and the westernization in Hong Kong.
Okay, great. A few questions. For a Hawaii business person traveling to China, what should they wear? What should they take with them as a standard business dress? Men and women.
For men, it is like the rest of Asia. It's coat and tie. But I have seen in China, especially in the summer, that they have been allowed to wear short sleeve shirts, but dress shirts, but short sleeve dress shirts. But if you're in meetings, you would have a coat and tie. Women, again, dress conservatively. Business suits. I wore a lot of slacks and jackets, or a regular business suit. Don't go casual. It is still somewhat formal.
Plus, I think most companies coming from Hawaii to China would be considered a supplier or a vendor. Yeah. So you're there on sales calls and doing that kind of thing. And at that point, you should be slightly more formal than the people you're visiting anyway. So a coat and tie, I think, is...
And Hong Kong, she's even more formal.
Yeah.
Men definitely coat and tie, and women in suits. All my suits come from Hong Kong because when I was working there, that's what I wear. I don't even wear slacks.
Hong Kong, to me, was
I
like
wore suits.
Manhattan on the South China Sea. I mean, people dressed very similarly. They sort of behaved very similarly. A lot of hustle and bustle, and you can't go wrong with just black suit, either men or women in Hong Kong for sure. It's just like New York City, in my opinion. But it's much more humid and hot. So when you're wearing a suit in Hong Kong, you should, if you have a couple, you should take a couple because you will definitely perspire there. Just a couple of quick comments about China from my perspective, that China is a huge country, much like the United States. And I think when you go to China, there's actually a lot of similarities between the people in some ways, I feel like, more so than you think. And I think Chinese people tend to think that there's similarities between China and the U.S. that in business you should focus on those similarities and not worry about the differences. And you'll see, if you've never been to China, you go to China for the first time, it's big. There's big buildings, there's big wide roads, there's it feels like not Japan or it's not Korea. It feels like a big country, and it's so big that there's many dialects. And I dare say that Beijing compared to, say, Western China, or Beijing compared to even Shanghai, is much different than even New York and Los Angeles, or Detroit and New Orleans, or Boston and Seattle, right? Those are all different, but in China, they're really pretty different, right? It can be quite different to the tune of they speak almost different languages. I mean, Mandarin sort of overrides the whole country now, but that wasn't always the case. I mean, we could have said here 10 or 15 years ago in Hong Kong that it was all Cantonese. Now Mandarin is much more prevalent, but when I first started living there and working there, Cantonese was the primary language of Hong Kong, or even in parts of China south of Shanghai, you still speak a lot of Cantonese, and that's changed a lot for the mainland of China. I would also say that I learned that negotiations seem to just go on and on and on. It's sort of like you feel like it's never going to end. And eventually it does, but as a foreigner working there, it just seems like you never feel like you're getting towards the end, but you are. It just, as somebody who's trying to get things done quickly, it's just not going to work that way. And I found one of the key things about to work in China, if you're traveling there, is don't tell anybody your schedule, because they understand then that you have a deadline and you're trying to get this deal done in the 5 days you're in Beijing or whatever. If they push you, just say you're there for 3 months or something, so that they don't, you can make it seem like, well, I can come back next week and meet or whatever. It just seemed to me that once they knew your schedule, they felt they had you pinned in and they were going to get the deal they wanted out of you before you had to leave, right? That was sort of always important. And then the other thing I found during the negotiations, and this could go on for months and months and months, is that there would be an MOU. Did you ever run across that?
Yes.
Where
Yes.
during a meeting, or at the end of the meeting, they would summarize by saying, okay, here's our memorandum of understanding, and this is where we are now in our negotiations, to sort of put it on paper. And they'd actually get you to sign it, and somebody from their side would sign it. It's sort of a snapshot of where we are now. And it would, the next time you come back for the negotiation, you could kind of work from that snapshot. But as I said, it sort of never really ended, and that I sold, at one point in my career, selling a lot of capital equipment into the semiconductor industry, and we would sell, you can imagine, it's just a big piece of machinery, and you get close to signing the contract, but then they'd come back and they said, well, we actually need a vacuum cleaner because we need to, at some point, clean that thing. And it would always something, but the things that they would request would get smaller and smaller and smaller, and that was how you'd sort of figure out you were near the end of the negotiations, right? But you have to be open to those kinds of things.
Are there any differences between negotiating or dealing with the old Hong Kongese as opposed to the newbies coming from mainland China?
Do you have an opinion on that?
As I said, Hong Kong, although there's a huge respect for, of course, the top leaders who are the older people, but increasingly, just as Brenda mentioned, Nowadays, the younger people have, let's say if it's owned by a family and they have younger, generation coming up, the younger generation tend to be the one that influence the decision. So they are a lot more straightforward, a lot faster. Dealing with people coming from China, if they come to Hong Kong, they start adapting a little bit to the way the Hong Kong people do it, because one of the reasons they come to Hong Kong is so that they can do business with, the international market. So there's a little bit of difference. I mean, there's certainly a stronger sense of relationship from the Chinese coming down than it would be from the Hong Kong Chinese. Hong Kong Chinese tend to be more economically minded as well because of the westernization.
There was still a little bit of resentment there between the two groups.
Oh, definite. No, there's a definite resentment, not a little bit, a lot. The Hong Kong Chinese are not happy about all these mainland Chinese coming down. In fact, if you read newspaper in Hong Kong, full of criticism of these Chinese immigrant coming in and spitting in the street, and they even mention about a child going to the bathroom in the street because the parents are, kind of, in China they have these slit bottom, they don't wear diapers, right? So
Right.
they have these slit bottom pants, and whenever the kids want to go bathroom, they just put them down on the street and, on the side of the street, whatever go. And in Hong Kong, a little bit more organized. They used to spit on the street too, mind you. And they used to be fined on it. And then things slowly but surely, they got that a little bit better. And then the Chinese came down. And so start all over again. And the Hong Kong Chinese, you would think, oh, you used to do that, right? So why are you critical of Chinese coming down? But they are.
You mentioned one thing about number 4, to avoid it, but I would also add maximize your ability to use the number 8 in your pricing, and everything should end in 88
Yes, 8.
cents or whatever.
And even 3s are considered
Nine's
good
good,
numbers.
too.
Yeah, 9 is
9 and
8 and
3s
9.
are also good numbers. So I used to work for a bank, a local bank, the very last one I worked for, and the CFO always made sure that our financials end in 8s or 3s, somewhere there, whether it's a cent or the whatever. But we would have
Very
3333, or 83 or whatever. So.
Regarding business attire, because we're so much more casual here, and one of the things I've noticed with many agents, especially if you're working with qualitative elements, it's really helpful to get a suit or business attire that has quality and is more tailored versus, that fit and proportion are important along with the quality of the, if you're gonna have a suit, the best that you can afford, kind of thing, because I've seen Asian business people actually pretty much eyeball people. Kind of belt the man is wearing and so forth. A lot of brand consciousness goes into.
In China, they're very brand conscious now, and to the extreme, where you would have women literally that I meet with, from head to toe is a brand. It's whether it's the jewelry or the jacket or the shoes or the bag or whatever. Everything is Gucci or Chanel or Louis Vuitton or whatever. But in Hong Kong, actually not so much. Hong Kong, they will wear conservatively, and you can wear pants. It's not really recommended, but at least with a jacket.
I was referring also Japan and Korea.
Oh yeah, Japan will come to that. Japan definitely they want well or high-end type of clothing, but conservative.
My experience is, my career I've almost always been a salesman of some product. And I think in the sales world, you have to be careful that you don't go in looking too,
Shabby.
what's the term?
Shabby.
Flashy, but
Shabby. Oh,
no,
shabby.
no, you can't really be, you can afford to give discounts. That's, go in with your best Rolex and your best this and everything. You put yourself in a rough position in that way. I learned that a lot in Japan and Taiwan in particular. People in Taiwan noticed that, and I've had people bring that up to me. That, well, if you can afford that car, then you should be able to give us a couple % off, or
That's probably true.
everything's fair game. But I'm not saying you go in there looking, wearing rags, but on the other hand, you just have to be conservative about it and not be super, super flashy. Of course, it depends on your role, right? If you're selling a Hollywood movie or something like that, that's different. But if you're just a salesman or saleswoman from Hawaii trying to peddle your goods, I just don't think you go in there totally dressed to the nines. You look successful, but not the kind of successful that you feel like you can give them 10% off.
That's the difference. When we were selling packages of airplanes worth $10 billion, they kind of expect you to be a little high-end.
Sure.
Yeah, depends
Yeah,
on what
it
you
depends.
sell.
No, it depends
Depend on
on
what you sell.
It depends on what you sell, of course. Of course.
By the way, one thing, as I sit here, don't, for the guys. So I cross my leg, I don't know how many times I had to warn, presidents of companies, et cetera,
Yeah,
keep
but I cross
both
my leg
feet
kind of
on the floor.
and
If you're
one
going
leg.
in to talk to somebody of importance, keep
Okay.
both feet on the floor.
Okay. It depends, right? Like in Japan, actually, that is supposed to be the protocol in that the good manners is you don't cross your leg, especially men. Women, it's a little bit tough because a lot of time you go into this meeting room where it's on a low sofa. For me, it's a short woman, right? If I have both of my feet on the floor, it's not too bad. But for a tall woman and the legs go up and you can sort of see into the skirt because you're wearing skirt, it could be embarrassing. So I don't see a difficulty in women crossing legs, but it has to be very tasteful. Usually you cross the legs and you put it sort of like on the side like that, rather than, crossing like you're a man, trying to be overwhelming. So yes, there is that very unofficial sitting type of proper way of sitting.
I've noticed a lot of Americans when they go to Japan or sometimes Korea, but especially in Japan, and you might have a formal meal out where you're sitting on a tatami mat and you're expected to sort of sit on the floor
Tough, very tough.
for a couple hours. It's extremely difficult on the back if you're not used to that, and I see people really squirming around and trying to adjust and get comfortable. That's difficult. There's no way around that. You just have to do whatever you
It's
do.
acceptable for to sit with your, like for women especially. You're supposed to really sit on your legs, right? With your feet pointed in type of thing. But that's very tough. So it is allowable or acceptable for you to sort of sit with your legs on the side.
Eventually, yeah.
And all that. And a lot of places now, restaurants, they have this hole where you can put your legs under. So that helps.
Okay, just before we go on to Japan, are there any quick comments about Taiwan? You've spent a lot of time in Taiwan.
I don't have any about Taiwan. For me, the culture in Taiwan was very similar to China. I didn't see any differences, to be honest with you, with Taiwan and China. Not in my experience. I don't know about others,
Well,
but it's pretty
I
similar.
also traveled to Taiwan a lot, and that I found in Taiwan is actually they're more traditional than China. That the old Confucian system and all that, they haven't been under communism, so there's a lot of that liberal type of mentality under communism where they said equality and so on doesn't really exist in Taiwan. And so they do follow a lot of the old tradition, all that, but a little bit more, in a way, more casual in terms of their dealing with you rather than making things so formal. They don't require a lot of formality.
I think because you don't have the Communist Party that you're
Exactly.
accounting to.
I think Taiwan
That's the difference.
to me, Taiwan was an extremely easy place to
Yeah.
live
Yeah.
and work and do business, and it didn't matter if you spoke Chinese or not. You figure it out along the way. It was just
They're very accommodating.
very, very great.
And they love Americans.
Yeah, great place.